So you're tuning in because, well, you want to cut through all the noise, right?
Yeah.
And figure out what's really going on in America in 2025.
Exactly.
Think of this as your curated briefing. A deep dive into the stuff that actually matters, the big forces shaping things.
Hmm.
We've pulled together a whole lot of sources, economic trends, what people are thinking from polls like Ipsos, Pew Research, Gallup.
Right. And also reports from groups like the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the Counselors of Real Estate. Pretty heavyweight analysis.
Yeah, and we're even keeping in mind how everything's connected. That whole tipping point idea, like Gladwell talks
It
about.
all feeds into each other. So our mission here is pretty straightforward, really. We want to pull out the essential stuff from all this information.
Go right to the point.
Yeah, give you a clear picture of what's most important, provide some context, maybe those aha moments, without just drowning you in data.
Makes sense.
We're going to walk through about 10 key areas. And honestly, we found some surprising connections that I think you'll find, well, pretty interesting.
Okay, let's jump in. Top of mind for probably almost everyone. The rising cost of, well, everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Inflation, cost of living.
Yeah.
It just keeps coming up as a major, major concern.
You see it everywhere.
You do. And early 2025 data from Ipsos, it shows that something like 43% of Americans see their household costs as the #1 challenge right now.
43%. Wow, that's a heavy weight for people. And it's not just a vague feeling, is it? The sources point to some specific things pushing prices up.
That's right. We're still seeing some lingering effects from those global supply chain snags.
Yeah.
Energy prices are still, up and down, unpredictable.
Tariffs. I saw mention of that.
Yeah, there's talk of new tariffs on imports. Maybe 10, even 20%. That could really add to the cost of goods coming in.
So what does that actually mean for, day-to-day life?
Well, the sources are clear. It means higher prices for basics. Food, rent, gas for the car. It's really putting the squeeze on household budgets.
And fixing it isn't easy, I gather.
No, not simple at all. It needs this careful balancing act, right? Using monetary policy, that's the central bank stuff. Managing money supply and fiscal policy, which is government spending and taxes.
Sounds tricky.
It is. And navigating that balance is even tougher with the political gridlock we often see. Makes decisive action difficult.
Okay, that definitely connects to another big pressure point. Healthcare, costs, getting access. Seems like it gets worse every year.
It really does feel that way. And the data backs it up. Pew Research from this year, 2025, shows a pretty big jump in worry. 67% of Americans now call healthcare affordability a major problem.
67%. That's up quite a bit, isn't it?
It is. It's a 10-point jump from just last year. That's significant.
10 points. Wow. What's driving that?
Well, it's a few things piling up. Insurance premiums keep climbing. Prescription drugs, the cost is just relentless. And then there are those out-of-pocket expenses that can really hit hard.
Especially for some families more than others.
Definitely. Lower-income families feel this burden disproportionately. And interestingly, the sources also bring up the killing of the United Healthcare CEO back in 2024.
Yeah, I remember that. A shocking event.
And the analysis suggests it really kind of intensified the spotlight on the whole healthcare system, exposed some of the maybe inherent flaws or stresses in the insurance model we have now.
So, are there solutions being discussed?
There are. People are talking about things like AI-driven tools. Maybe they could streamline things, cut down some costs.
That sounds promising. Maybe.
Potentially.
Like,
But, and this is a big but, the sources also stress there's still really strong resistance to more fundamental changes. Things like government price controls for drugs or big expansions of public insurance programs.
so the political divide is a major roadblock there, too.
Seems to be. Yeah, it's a significant obstacle.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving from our personal finances and health to the nation's balance sheet. The national debt and the budget deficit, this always feels like this huge looming cloud.
It really does. And the numbers are, well, they're pretty stark, aren't they?
They are. 57% of Americans in 2025 see the federal budget deficit as a critical issue. And what's interesting, according to Pew, is that concern is growing, even among Democrats now. It's becoming more bipartisan, that worry.
And looking ahead, what are the projections?
Well, if you look at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, they've put out a pretty stark warning. They project that if current policies stick around, like extending tax cuts without finding ways to pay for them,
Right.
the national debt could balloon to 140% of GDP within a decade.
140% of GDP, our entire economy's output for a year.
Exactly. GDP is the total value of everything produced. And yeah, 140% is a massive jump from where we are now, which is already around 99%.
That paints a really worrying picture for the long term. And isn't there some kind of deadline coming up soon?
There is the debt ceiling. It's set to become an issue again around mid-2025.
Oh boy, here we go again.
Looks like it. And it's already sparking partisan demands. Republicans, for instance, are reportedly talking about needing huge spending cuts like $2.5 trillion before they'll agree to raise it.
Which, if they can't agree, could cause real problems, couldn't it?
Absolutely. The sources warn about potential economic instability, higher borrowing costs for the government for sure, which then kind of ripples out into the rest of the economy. It's a high-stakes situation if it's not handled well.
Okay. Let's shift gears to another topic where there's a lot of division. Immigration and border policy.
Yeah, this is definitely a persistent point of contention. Gallup data from 2024 showed nearly half, 48% of Americans listed illegal immigration as a top issue. That's a big number.
And what are the plans looking like for 2025?
Well, the Trump administration's stated goals include things like expanding the border wall and increasing deportations quite significantly.
How would they fund that?
They're looking at different budget maneuvers, trying to find ways to allocate the funds needed for those kinds of projects and operations.
But plans like that, they're bound to face pushback, right?
Oh, almost certainly. Our sources expect strong opposition, particularly from Democrats. And then there are just the practical realities.
Like what?
Well, the strain on resources at the border itself, managing increased operations, plus potential diplomatic tensions, especially with Mexico. These are real significant hurdles.
It's not just policy, is it? It touches on bigger things.
Exactly. When you dig into the source material, this debate connects to really fundamental issues for society. Security, economics, even questions about cultural identity. It's incredibly complex.
So many layers. Okay, now let's talk about something that feels like it's kind of underneath a lot of these specific issues. Political division and maybe, as some sources say, failures in leadership.
That's a really crucial lens, I think. The sources really emphasize that this deep political polarization isn't just, background noise. It's actively getting in the way of solving problems.
Making it harder to actually do things?
Precisely. Even back in 2023, about 21% of Americans were saying poor leadership was the top problem facing the country. And that feeling seems to have just carried right on into 2025.
And after the 2024 election, the difference in outlook was really something, wasn't it?
It was incredibly stark. You had something like 76% of Republicans feeling optimistic about the country's direction compared to only 20% of Democrats.
Wow, that's a huge gap.
It really is. And when you have that kind of chasm, finding common ground on those big critical issues, healthcare, debt, climate change, becomes incredibly difficult. Progress just stalls.
Feels like we're often just stuck.
And what fuels this, according to the analysis? Yeah. Well, it's partly this broader erosion of trust in institutions. Plus, you have the ongoing issue of misinformation spreading easily and this lingering skepticism about election integrity for some people. It all feeds the division.
Okay, let's switch focus to something closer to home for many. Crime and community safety.
Right. And this is an interesting one because there's a bit of a disconnect. The official data, the sources note, actually shows violent crime rates have dropped somewhat.
Oh, really? Because it doesn't always feel that way.
Exactly. Public fear, public concern about safety remains quite high. Around 22% of Americans in 2025 still list safety as a major worry.
So why the gap? What's driving the fear if violent crime is down?
Well, the analysis points to more visible issues. Things like homelessness, the challenges of drug addiction playing out in public spaces, and maybe increases in things like shoplifting. These contribute to a general sense of unease in communities, even if the most serious crime stats are lower.
And how are policymakers responding?
The trend seems to be towards more reactive punitive measures. We're seeing renewed support for stricter sentencing laws. Think back to California in 2024. Measures like that are gaining traction elsewhere, too.
Focusing on punishment after the fact.
Pretty much. But what the sources also highlight is a relative lack of focus on the underlying causes. Poverty, mental health access, addiction treatment. Without addressing those root issues, you can get stuck in this cycle of just reacting to crime instead of trying to prevent it.
Treating symptoms, not the disease kind of thing. Okay, let's move to another issue hitting people's wallets hard. The housing crisis.
Yeah, this is a huge one. And growing. Data from the Counselors of Real Estate for 2025 is pretty staggering. 54% of renters are now spending over 30% of their income just on rent.
Over half of renters spending almost a third of their money just to keep a roof over their head.
Exactly. That's an immense financial burden. And it's not just renters feeling it, right? Owning a home is just seeming further and further out of reach for a lot of people, too.
Absolutely. What's causing the squeeze?
It's a mix of things, according to the sources. There's just not enough new housing being built to keep up with demand in many places. Demand itself stays high. And then you've got rising interest rates making mortgages more expensive.
So supply isn't meeting demand, basically.
That's the core of it. And what's stopping us from building more?
Good question.
Well, the analysis points to things like local regulations, zoning laws, permitting processes can be really slow and complex. Plus, you often get community opposition to new developments, the whole not in my backyard thing.
NIMBYism, right.
Right. And all that together just slows down efforts to increase the housing supply. So you end up with a large chunk of the population really struggling to find housing they can afford that's stable.
Huh.
And that affects everything: jobs, schools, stability.
It's such a fundamental need. Okay, let's broaden the scope again. Climate change and sustainability. A global issue, but with huge U.S. implications.
Definitely. And this is an area where that political division we talked about is just incredibly sharp.
Mm-hmm.
We have older data from 2021 showing 60% of Democrats saw climate change as a major issue versus only 14% of Republicans.
14%. Wow. Has that likely changed much?
Probably not drastically. That fundamental disagreement on the urgency and severity of the issue likely persists into 2025.
That's a massive gap. And the U.S. is under pressure internationally on this, right? To meet climate goals.
It is significant pressure.
Yeah.
But the policy signals coming out, according to our sources, can seem, well, conflicting.
How so?
On one hand, you have stated goals for cutting emissions, but on the other, there seems to be continued support for oil and gas production, and maybe even potential cuts to incentives for clean energy development.
So policies potentially working against each other?
That's a key tension highlighted in the analysis, yes. Meanwhile, the actual impacts of climate change, more extreme weather events, rising insurance costs in vulnerable areas, they're becoming harder and harder to ignore.
And globally.
Globally, there's also this acknowledged shortfall in climate finance.
Yeah.
Not enough money flowing towards adaptation and mitigation efforts worldwide. It adds another layer of complexity.
Feels like another area needing real consensus. Okay, moving towards the end here. Education and workforce gaps. Crucial for the future.
Absolutely critical for long-term prosperity. And the sources point to several challenges in education right now. Things like falling test scores in some areas, issues with student absenteeism, and these constant debates about funding.
And funding models themselves might be shifting?
Potentially, yeah. There's increased discussion, particularly Republican-backed ideas, about voucher programs, using public funds for private school tuition.
Right.
If those expand significantly in 2025, that could really change the landscape, potentially impacting public school budgets. At the same time, you see these big workforce challenges emerging.
Like what specifically?
Well, one example highlighted is the insurance industry. They're projecting a huge labor shortage, maybe 400,000 unfilled jobs by 2036.
400,000 in just one industry. That's massive.
It is, and it signals this broader need, emphasized in the sources, for really strategic investment. In education, yes, but also in specific job training programs to make sure workers have the skills needed for the economy that's evolving.
Makes sense. But it's hard to get that investment.
Often, yes. Progress gets bogged down in budget fights and these sort of ideological arguments about how education and training should work, who should pay for it.
Seems like a recurring theme. Okay, finally, let's touch on technology. AI, privacy. It's moving so fast.
It really is. And technology presents this classic double-edged sword, right? The sources make that clear. Huge opportunities, AI, 5G networks, all sorts of advancements, but also significant risks.
Can you give an example of that tension?
Sure. Look at AI and insurance again. You've got like 91% of firms investing in it, huge adoption. But then 84% of the actuaries, the risk assessment professionals in that field, are worried they don't have the right skills for this AI-driven future.
So even as they embrace it, there's anxiety about keeping up. And for the public, what are the big concerns?
Data privacy is huge. What happens to our information? Also the impact of social media, especially on kids and teens. And of course, cybersecurity, the constant threat of hacks and breaches hitting individuals, companies, even government.
Is anything being done legislatively?
There's actually some bipartisan agreement on needing better online safety laws. But these efforts often run into legal challenges, usually centered around free speech concerns. It gets complicated quickly.
So it's that balancing act again.
Exactly. How do you create policies that encourage all this amazing innovation, but also effectively protect people's privacy, their security, their general well-being in this super fast-changing tech world? That's the core challenge.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered these 10 areas. And listening to all this, the interconnectedness really stands out, doesn't it? These aren't just separate boxes.
Not at all. What happens with the economy affects housing, affects healthcare costs, affects political mood.
It all ripples.
Right. Which brings us back to that tipping point idea you mentioned at the start.
Exactly. Just like ideas can spread and create big shifts when conditions are right, maybe progress on these big challenges could too. But it needs that critical mass, public will, effective leadership working together.
Which really highlights the need to somehow bridge those political divides we kept running into. Find that common ground. Absolutely. Focus on the shared priorities most people likely agree on deep down. And the sources do suggest potential paths. Things like smart investments.
Like in education.
Yeah, education, green technology, workforce training, the stuff we talked about. Combine that with governance that's transparent, accountable, that could help rebuild some of that trust we've lost.
So wrapping up this deep dive into 2025, what's the main takeaway for you, the thing that sticks?
For me, it's this feeling that 2025 really is a pivotal moment. The challenges are, well, they're serious, they're complex, no doubt about it. But the analysis suggests they're not impossible to overcome.
Not insurmountable.
Right. But the path forward, it really seems to hinge on finding some collective resolve, a shared commitment to actually making tough decisions and taking action.
And that really makes you think, doesn't it? About our own part and your part as a listener in finding that collective resolve. Understanding these issues like we've tried to do here feels like maybe the essential first step.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.